Hello, this is Economic Performance, Section B, Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand Lecture. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 48. Objectively, we're going to analyze how the relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply impacts both unemployment and inflation. In microeconomics, which is mostly what we've been doing up to this point, the focus is on individual markets and how the interaction of consumers and producers impact these individual markets. But now that we're moving into macroeconomics, the focus rather turns to the economy as a whole. So not the actual small working parts, but just how it all has come together. Microeconomics is predominantly concerned with how businesses and people make decisions on a very small scale. There's considerable time spent trying to understand both consumer and producer motives. This mostly focuses on how supply and demand impacts markets, i.e. price, quantity on that small scale. Instead of the microeconomic focus on supply and demand, macroeconomics instead focuses on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So what we look at isn't dramatically different. So instead of price and quantity, now it's kind of total price level and total production overall. Aggregate demand is the total spending for all types of goods and services in the economy. So our demand curve looks like that. So it's not dramatically different than what it was before, although usually you will notice a little bit more shape to it. And aggregate supply is the total quantity of goods and services produced in the economy. So it looks more like that. Going to have that kind of shape to it most of the time too. Additionally, the focus during microeconomics on price and quantity shifts toward total price level and total production, which in a sense could basically mean real GDP also during the macroeconomics. Now, since one person's spending becomes another person's income, the relationship between potential aggregate supply and aggregate demand is an important determinant in the levels of unemployment and inflation in the economy. When growth of aggregate demand equals that of the growth of aggregate supply, the economy is at a full employment, non-inflationary equilibrium, which means you would see no difference in either unemployment or inflation. So if things can kind of maintain this level, then generally speaking, things stay good for pretty much everyone. Now, when aggregate demand falls below aggregate supply growth, production declines and some resources become unemployed in the short run. So let me describe what I mean by that. All right, so that basically means the aggregate demand cannot keep up with the aggregate supply, meaning the spending does not keep up with aggregate supply. So when that happens, first you got to find the bottom of your aggregate demand curve. You got to go on the left-hand side of it and then make another aggregate demand curve. Again, I'm going to call that something else so I know that I'm talking about something different. So basically, what do I do now? X marks the spot. That's right, X marks the spot. So at this new point, basically what we're going to notice is a decline in production. So helpful hint when we're talking about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and total production. So if production has declined, that is going to have an effect on jobs. So you can essentially also think of, instead of quantity, you could also think of this as meaning jobs. So if you are producing less products, generally speaking, most business owners aren't going to say, man, no one's buying our products. Please, Steve, just keep coming back to work every single day, even though no one's buying your products. Usually that means at some level, Steve here or there is probably going to lose their jobs because overall production is actually falling. So therefore, when we see this, that basically means increase of unemployment, the evil monster, unemployment. Now, when aggregate demand growth rises above aggregate supply, competition for productive resources increase and costs and prices rise in the short run. All right, so in other words, if aggregate demand actually starts to increase at a faster rate than production levels, all right, so how we demonstrate that? Find the aggregate demand at the bottom, go to the right-hand side of it, and then we make another aggregate demand curve. I'll name this something else just so I know I'm talking about a completely different point. Where do I find my equilibrium? X marks the spot. That's right, kids. X marks the spot. So, therefore, what we're going to notice when that happens is now we see an increase of our price levels, which means whenever people try to buy things, it's going to cost them more money to buy those things now. So therefore, I've just now introduced you to another monster that plagues our economy, and that evil monster's name is inflation. Rawr. Now, these changes in aggregate demand influence the amount of disposable income, or income that's available for use after taxes have been paid, which experiences increases as aggregate demand increases, or possibly the vice versa. So either of those things is going to affect your extra money you have to just dispose of by going to a store and just buying stuff with. There are a variety of policy options that are available to combat inflation, including monetary and fiscal policies, which we'll talk in depth about in the next unit, wage and price controls, antitrust actions, tax incentives, and automatic adjustment mechanisms. Many economists actually believe that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, at least in the short run. So if the government acts to stimulate aggregate demand, which means give people more money to spend, to fight unemployment, inflation is likely to increase. All right, so if the government is looking at this and determines that, unemployment is way too high, we need to do something to stop unemployment. So if they're trying to stop unemployment, that means they would want to increase the aggregate demand. So therefore, they want to do things that's going to give people more money. So therefore, aggregate demand will shift to the right. Where do I go? X marks the spot. All right, so what we have noticed at this new point is, well, we are going to have an increase in total production levels, which you might remember, I basically told you, total production means jobs. So when you see that, that basically means jobs. So therefore, more people have more money to spend, therefore they buy more things, which results in people having more jobs. So yay, we conquered the unemployment monster. Whoa! The consequence of that, is, guess who's back? Back again. Inflation's back, tell a friend. So the consequence of more jobs is prices are going to go up. And if the government acts to restrain aggregate demand to fight inflation, unemployment is likely to increase. So to see how that affects that, so if the government looks at the economy and they determine that, oh no, inflation is way too high, then the government might have policies that might actually cause the aggregate demand to decrease. So if you want to decrease aggregate demand, find aggregate demand, go to the left of it, make a new aggregate demand curve. I'll probably call that something else, so I know I'm talking about a different point. So therefore, first I have to find my new X marks the spot. So basically at this point, this shows us that, yay, we killed the inflation monster. Whoa, we did it! The consequence is, well, total production levels will also probably decline, which means if you're producing less products, that means less jobs. So that is going to be the consequence to doing that. Now, something else that can happen is a situation called stagflation. Now, when you have stagflation, this is the combination of high unemployment and high inflation in the same time period. This doesn't happen frequently, but it has happened on occasion. Notably, in the 1970s, we had an issue of very high unemployment and high inflation going on at the same time. People tend to form expectations using both past experiences and predictions about present and future government policies, which may have an impact upon the effectiveness of government policy actions. All right, that concludes Economic Performance, Section B, Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand lecture. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 48, and objectively now you can analyze how the relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply impacts both unemployment and inflation.